Hello.
Hello, hello.
How you doing today?
Doing good, thank you very much.
Cool, cool. Okay, so we're just doing a short one today because you got a panel in about an hour. But you found a video about the strategy of geoeconomics. That's
Yes.
and it sounds like you're familiar with this channel and you think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, this channel is called Strategy Stuff. It deals with it's like very, very dry analysis, usually of more like military stuff. But it sometimes but that it often crosses into like geopolitics stuff as well. And I think this is one of its better videos for being like very just like direct and like easy to grasp.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, yeah. That sounds like I'm not super into the military stuff specifically, but I am really into like game theory applications. Applying that outside of games. So I don't know. This seems like an interesting thing to discuss.
Yeah. All right. And then let me know if that's working and
It is.
This video will be about
Oh,
the
it's very
strategy
quiet
of
though.
geoeconomics, which covers how states use or should
That's
use
good. Thank
their
you.
economic power in pursuit of geopolitical goals. This video aims to introduce the concept, outline the elements of geoeconomic strategy, and finally, come up with two strategic blueprints that states can use to achieve their goals. First, we have to be clear about what geoeconomics is not. Geoeconomics is not about states pursuing economic instead of geopolitical ends. Geoeconomics is not about foreign policy being driven by economic concerns. And geoeconomics is not about states using their economy to fuel a military machine. One way of thinking about geoeconomics is to think of it as fourth-generation geopolitics. This refers to fourth-generation warfare, which proposes that in modern war, the decisive contest may not actually be on the physical battlefield. Instead, targeting the meta-dimensions of modern warfare, communications, logistics, legal, and especially political, may well prevent the enemy from even coming to the battle in the first place. Russia's actions in Crimea are an example where speed, ambiguity, propaganda, and legal procedure all combined to deny the West a viable reason for intervention, leaving Russia in sole possession of the field by default.
That doesn't seem to have worked super well for
In the
them.
same way, the
this video is, I think, referring specific. This video came out 4 years ago. It's referring to Crimea specifically, not the later invasion Russia had into Ukraine in 2022, right? Yes.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. As far as the first thing you said, it's like the decisive engagement may not be on the battlefield itself. I could buy that in situations where the conflict is just completely averted by, political maneuvering. Um, I think there's probably a lot of other situations where all that other stuff he was talking about still matters, but it matters because it affects what happens on the battlefield. Like people
Yeah.
just supplying resources to Ukraine in their current conflict, for example.
economic meta-dimension within geopolitics can also be targeted. States that achieve economic dominance are in a good position to achieve geopolitical goals, as rivals either compromise or are compromised due to their economic dependency. The rise of geoeconomics is due to several factors. Firstly, the high costs of modern war have diminished the power of diplomatic and military threats. Secondly, while states still prioritize their own security, citizens also expect them to ensure their economic well-being, and will replace governments based on the state of the economy. Lastly, today's globalized economy has created a new
Sorry, I just wanted to comment on one thing there. It's really interesting. Something that sort of reminds me of is in the Civil War. a huge thing in the Civil War was the fact, or rather, a huge strategy in the Civil War, part of specifically the Southern strategy, was explicitly to try not to try and defeat the Union militarily, but to make the cost of conflict so high that the Union would not want to, that the Northern states would be like, man, completely bankrupting our country and potentially suffering war fatigue, especially by the South attacking the North. Many Southern generals talked about this. If we could attack the North, that would make the cost of war much higher, and it would be a much harder sell for Lincoln and the politicians of the North to be like, we need to do this if the North truly feels the toll of warfare. That's something I always thought is really interesting. The South never wanted to militarily win. Well, I should say never wanted to, but there was a real emphasis on trying to just make the cost so high that it would no longer be pursued. Another great example, I think, would probably be like Vietnam, like in more contemporary American history, right, where arguably militarily we were still doing, we could have stayed much longer if we really wanted to, but the political will just wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Vietnam, because I was thinking while you were talking about that although it didn't work for the Confederacy, that seems to be like a pretty successful option in many other wars for whoever is the defending party, basically, because to defend successfully, you don't have to completely wipe out the attacker. You just have to make it no longer worth it for them to continue attacking you. And you could see a similar thing in ecology as well, right? Like a lot of prey animals will just make it so that they're not worth the cost of hunting them down.
Dimension of strategic competition. Power is no longer limited to controlling geopolitical territories and choke points, but also on ownership of key industrial sectors, markets, and supply chains. Mastering this new arena is, essentially, the point of geoeconomics. So we have seen how geoeconomics offers potential solutions to geopolitical questions. But why geoeconomics instead of plain old economics? After all, economists can argue that if states run the economy based on purely economic rather than geopolitical principles, they will grow faster, which in turn gives them greater options and leverage against geopolitical enemies. Running the economy with an eye towards geopolitical goals will only be counterproductive, as state meddling interferes with growth. The geoeconomic response comes in a critique of Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage, a key model mathematically demonstrating the benefits of free trade. Suppose two countries and two initial goods. Britain is better at making cloth, Portugal is better at making wine. If both countries try to produce both goods by themselves, they get a small amount of each. Ricardo demonstrated that if each country focuses on its advantage, Portugal on wine and Britain on cloth, they will make a larger amount of their chosen product. Trade with each other, and they will both end up with more goods compared with going it alone. This relationship holds even if Portugal is better than Britain in producing both wine and cloth. So here, we see how economic principles encourage specialization and trade, which in turn leads to both countries having more resources to spend on geopolitical ends. In response, geoeconomists point out two things. Firstly, the relationship must be analyzed in terms of its long-term impact, not just short-term economic gains. So let's specify that this example of comparative advantage analyzes long-term gains, which leads to the second point, which is that this model assumes that the economic effect of specializing in wine and specializing in cloth are the same. But they are not. Cloth is a standard gateway industry. It encourages urbanization, social development, industrial growth, and mechanization. It also stimulates derivative industries like dyes, design, and machine tools. These characteristics exist to a much lesser degree, if at all, when it comes to the wine industry. So in our model, cloth-focused Britain is set for industrial takeoff. It will stimulate the rapid and massive growth of simple manufacturing firms, educating entrepreneurs on the intricacies of mechanization and industrial management. These firms will drive the development of an internal market, earning profits that can be used to invest in increasingly complex and innovative production, which in turn stimulates entrepreneurs and internal markets even more in a positive feedback loop. In such a way, Britain easily can become richer and more developed than a Portugal that has dumped its cloth industry. Well, okay, the economist says, but Portugal still remains better off in this scenario. By specializing and trading, it will still get more than it would producing everything by itself. And furthermore, through trading with developed Britain, Portugal gets goods that it can't even produce at all. The result is still more resources to potentially spend on geopolitics. But this argument ignores the geoeconomic and geopolitical consequences of lopsided economic development. In war, wealthy Britain will naturally prevail over poor Portugal, but even in peace, Britain's wealth will give it significant geoeconomic advantages over Portugal. Britain can use its money to buy up Portugal's resources and firms, gaining a say in how Portugal's economy is run. This British economic dominance means that Portugal actually needs Britain's cooperation to fund its strategy. Needless to say, this means that in a geopolitical dispute between Portugal and Britain, Britain wins by default. So we can see how blindly following economic principles has resulted in negative geopolitical benefit for Portugal. It has gained more resources, but they have been rendered irrelevant since geoeconomic dependence has already led to Britain's geopolitical victory. Under a geoeconomic strategy, Portugal would have insisted on keeping its own cloth industry, sacrificing short-term economic benefit for long-term geoeconomic and geopolitical benefit. To update Clemenceau's quote, "The economy has become too important to be left to economists."
That's a good quote.
As repeatedly stressed, the point of geoeconomics is to support broader geopolitical strategy. In practice, this support comes in the form of hard or soft economic power. Hard economic power coerces and deters by threatening economic destruction, embargoes, withdrawal of investment, currency and stock manipulation, and so on. Soft power is about shaping rivals' behavior and goals through enticements, structures, and links. For example, the US will only allow states to use the IMF or US dollar if they conform to certain behavioral standards, while states conform to Chinese geopolitical desires in order to obtain loans. Hard and soft economic power are of course not mutually exclusive, and in most cases are two sides of the same coin. What is relevant for our purposes is that both methods require a strong and influential economy. Clearly, embargoes and enticements do not work if the economy is too small or too irrelevant to have a meaningful effect on a rival. Geoeconomic strategy therefore aims for two things in general. Firstly, the creation of a large economy, and secondly, the creation of a relevant economy, either in the sense of controlling critical industrial links or being in the relevant markets. How this is done will be the subject of the remaining part of this video.
Can we pause for a second? At the beginning, the guy was saying that geoeconomics is not about using the economy to fuel the geopolitical strategy, but so far it seems like that's exactly what he's talking about.
I think he just means that it's not about, the thing is not in and of itself about being able to, it's not about fueling the economy to be able to like make more tanks, but it is about how the economy can affect the conflict in and of itself. I think that's the distinction.
I guess that's a pretty subtle distinction, though. I mean, obviously, like,
I think it gets like the core of what he's trying to talk about is like the economy affecting the economy affects not your ability to make tanks, but your economic entanglements affect what moves you can even make geopolitically in the first place.
yeah, they affect like who are going to be your allies and your enemies, and like
Yeah.
what kind of strategic position you're in before you ever get into the business of tanks. But I guess, but yeah,
Yeah, I think that's all he's trying to say.
okay.
The core element in military strategy is force or firepower. Everything is about creating, deploying, and supporting units so that the right arrangement of firepower is in place to achieve the strategic goal. In a similar vein, the core element in geoeconomic strategy is capital. Everything is about creating, deploying, and supporting firms so that the right arrangement of capital is in place to achieve the strategic goal. Capital is needed to invest in production and grow the economy, and capital is what firms need to expand and maintain their positions within markets. Capital is generated by firms in industrial sectors. As implied in the analysis of comparative advantage, not all industrial sectors are created equal, and firms in capital-rich sectors, mostly services, will generate outsized profit and capital compared with others. These rich economic territories are of course needed to fund geoeconomic strategy, but the nature of geoeconomics means that it is more interested in industries that also have geopolitical impact. These strategic industries, perhaps less cash-rich, but certainly more influential, include 1. Scarce yet critical industrial resources like oil, machine tools, or microchips. 2. Services that underwrite the modern economy, like communications and finance. 3. High-tech, high-innovation industries that create and monopolize entirely new markets. Additionally, apart from industrial sectors, states also need to consider the value chain dimension of geoeconomics. When we look at the value chain smile curve, we find that the bottom of the smile, consisting of simple, labor-intensive work like assembly, is powerless and capital poor.
It's funny he mentions some of those examples he gave, microchips. This was made 4 years ago, but just recently, I think it was just at the end of last year, we had that chips bill that passed in America to try and secure the sort of industry of microchips in the United States. I was going to say China, but I guess technically it would be for any country, although obviously the one we're most concerned about is China.
Yeah, we briefly covered this several months ago. When we did a video where we were talking a bunch about the situation with Taiwan. Yeah.
By contrast, the capital or knowledge-intensive TIPS, R&D, design, management, marketing, are not only capital-rich, they are also inherently powerful positions that impose their aims and values on subordinates and customers. Needless to say, geoeconomic strategy aims to occupy these positions. Last is the concept of markets, which generally still correspond to political borders. There are capital-rich markets, of course, but generally strategic targets here tend to be selected for purely geopolitical reasons, either because they bring great political benefits or because they can neutralize the opposition of a broader political bloc. Now that we know what the elements of geoeconomic strategy are, we can think about how states can manipulate them to achieve strategic goals. States can use the means at their disposal either in an offensive fashion, deploying capital to seize control of strategic economic territory, or in a defensive fashion, preventing others from doing the same. Here, we group these means into 3 categories: regulatory, financial, and directional, representing increasing state intervention in the economy. Regulatory means set out the rules of the game within an economy, consisting of laws, standards, and bureaucratic procedure. Barring additional intervention, Firms playing within the rules are free to deploy and direct capital in the most efficient way possible. States can of course still tweak the rules to loosely guide firms towards offensive geoeconomic goals, such as by raising minimum standards to stimulate the innovation needed to capture sectors or rise up the value chain. More commonly, however, regulatory means are used defensively to prevent firms from sacrificing geoeconomic imperatives in search of maximum profit. Minimum standards keep out firms who try to undercut innovative firms based on cost.
A great example of this would be in many trade deals like NAFTA, or the TPP had a bunch of these, although obviously it never was implemented. There were requirements for like what minimum wage would have to be or what worker rights would be, because many of the sort of more developed countries in these trade deals had concerns, and still often do have concerns. I mean, this is a common talking point, right, about the idea that there's going to be a race to the bottom, right? Agricultural workers in America have to have these certain benefits and have to be paid this way in order to be legal. That's not the case in, like, let's say Mexico or let's say Vietnam. So if we start having free trade, then we are worried that our economies are going to suffer because our workers aren't going to be able to compete with the lower wages that some of these less developed nations have. So that's a great example of sort of how these sort of things play out in the real world, and you'll see negotiations about those go back and forth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How much do you think it has to do with wanting them to mirror our institutions in such a way that makes them more likely to align with us? Because, like, for example, if we get Mexico to adopt a bunch of like labor laws and environmental regulations that are similar to the United States, then in a way it kind of helps keep them in our orbit rather than drifting off toward China or something.
Oh yeah, no, that is a really big part of this stuff. I'm reminded. Oh god, I'm not going to remember the specific trade deal it was, but basically a lot of the stuff. There were a couple of the time, or I shouldn't say a lot of the stuff. There were a number of times that the Trump administration went for some sort of trade deal or tariff on China that ended up to get around it. There were some loopholes that were left in that allowed China to basically say, "Oh, we're gonna," it's a classic thing with like the Texas automotive supercluster. They assemble the car to 98% in Mexico, then they ship it to right across. They ship it an hour across the border to Texas, and they finish it in Texas, and now it's made in America. China was doing this with countries like Vietnam, which historically a lot of people don't realize this because they think of Vietnam, they think of the Vietnam War, but Vietnam does not like China. They actually like the U.S. quite a bit because as much bad history as America has with Vietnam, China has the bad history for much longer. In fact, a lot of people don't even realize China tried to invade China tried to invade Vietnam almost immediately after America got out because they've had ambitions to control that area for a long time. And there was a very unfortunate side effect of the Trump administration's policy. It was in order to get around these trade deals. Hello, Jack Pine Cedar. In order to get around these trade deals, they would do the thing Mexico does. They would assemble the thing to 98% completion. Then they would send it to a factory in Vietnam, and that factory in Vietnam would finish it. And as a result, you saw Vietnam being more economically integrated and tied into China and strengthening those bonds, which is the exact opposite of what we want to do. So that kind of stuff absolutely plays into this a lot and can inadvertently oftentimes be a huge source of diplomatic change, right? Those kinds of things are super important. Arguably, that's one of the reasons why TPP was so important and such a shame we didn't get it passed, is because that would have roped in a bunch of countries into our side of the world, not China. There's a similar sort of thing we have, although it's arguable whether or not it's good or bad. But there's a thing called the Wolf Amendment that basically says if you want to work with NASA, you can't work with China. So all of the space development stuff in the world, it's either China or the U.S. Because the Wolf Amendment says you work with China, you can't work with us. And then China, of course, is going to replicate that because they don't want their benefits going outwards. If ours aren't. And so as a result, there is a real bifurcation of that kind of stuff. TPP, we were hoping to kind of do a similar thing economically. Yeah.
While committees on foreign investment review acquisitions to ensure that economic secrets are not sold out to geoeconomic rivals. Financial means redistribute or inject capital into certain national champions, usually in situations where the free market is unable or unprepared to. They are used offensively to fund unprofitable investments that serve geopolitical purposes, and defensively to allow firms to maintain sectoral or market positions in response to a rival's offensive. There are two types of financial means. The first one is direct capital injection, where the state directly funds a national champion through subsidies, loans, and tech transfers. The other is the protected market, where the state erects tariffs to keep external competition out and allows the formation of cartels to do the same against internal competition. The result is that the monopolistic national champion can jack up prices, thus redistributing capital from the public to the champion without too much overt intervention. Directional means straight up direct national champions to compete for strategic sectors, positions, and markets, regardless of short-term profit. The less common defensive variant orders firms to hold on to legacy businesses for geopolitical benefit. The state can also direct firms to abandon investments and deals for purely geopolitical reasons, as China is infamous for doing.
Another funny thing, just talking about the chips, is there's a lot of regulation. So microchips is a very small industry. No, I should say small industry because that implies economically. But what I mean to say is that like there's only so many like factories in the world that make microchips. Like there's like a list of I think like less than like 50. And like for example, in order to like schedule those factories to make the highest grade chips, you have to schedule those out like years in advance. There was a bunch of stuff that when COVID happened. Anyways, sorry, that's a long way of saying there are a bunch of policies in place for the companies that make the machines that those factories use and where they're allowed to go. For example, I remember when we did that review of the chips bill, part of the provisions it was talking about were in regards to, I believe it was a Dutch company. It's a Dutch company that makes a certain kind of machine that's like basically it's the only company in the world that makes this kind of machine to make the newest and best microchips. And there was straight up like a law that says like this machine can never ever enter China. It may not, it can only enter these countries, and when it does, it has to be like under guard and stuff like this. So just another like example I thought was really interesting, where you see this kind of stuff playing out all the time and countries trying to make that kind of evaluation.
So it seems like one of the things that makes certain industries geopolitically significant on a graph like this would be that they can't be easily replicated in other places, mm-hmm. right? They are things that can spread throughout the world only through international trade.
Yeah, I bet like back in the day, I don't know if this isn't really as true anymore, but like oil would have been like a classic example that people talk about is, the countries trying to secure oil reserves. A lot of people think, in my opinion, incorrectly that like, for example, that's part of the reason why we went to Iraq and Afghanistan. And it very much was that very much was the case back in the day, that did happen quite a lot. Countries would just, invade to secure those kinds of resources. It's just interesting to see how then sort of the 21st century version of how the 21st century version of that operates.
Mm-hmm. I think that was a big thing in the Eastern European theater of World War II, if I recall. I believe
yes.
Germany was trying to secure the Russian oil fields.
All in all, states can select from a broad array of tools in order to influence capital and firms towards desired sectors, value chain positions, and markets in line with their geoeconomic and geopolitical goals. Free market economies may be more associated with regulatory means, and command economies with directional ones, but in reality, most economies utilize all three means to some degree. The US, for example, finances Boeing's exports through the Export-Import Bank, while European states financed and directed Airbus to seize the strategic high-tech sector of airplane production.
Another great example of this kind of involvement would be in, I don't know how familiar you are with the economy of South Korea, but part of the the economic development of South Korea in the aftermath of the Korean Civil War, the Korean War. I don't know if is that actually appropriate to refer to as the Korean Civil War. I don't know. It's always called the Korean War in America. I don't know. Anyways, the point is, they had these things, and they still have them called chaebol. I believe I actually no. I'm certain I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But chaebol.
You're very close to the right pronunciation.
Oh, okay. Let's go. Anyways, they are these sort of basically like mega corporation conglomerates. Samsung is one of them, like LG, and these are massive corporations that my understanding is have a lot of special rights and protections and get to operate in ways that other companies do not get to operate, and are hugely influential in the South Korean economy. I think, for example, like the biggest chaebol, my understanding is like something ridiculous, like 20% is responsible for like 20% of the South Korean economy. So just these ludicrously like massively important like conglomerations.
I guess they get favoritism because they're perceived as helping South Korea be internationally competitive.
Yeah. My understanding is that in the development of their economy, it was an explicit plan. Like they were like, how are we going to get ahead? Well, let's get these fucking let's set these guys up for success. It was very intentional, and it's a really controversial thing in South Korea. The big controversy that everyone knows about, and I know about because like I read like one article about this, and now I pretend I know everything. There was an instance where these chaebols, first off, they're like owned by families, right? So these families are almost like a form of like not literally royalty, but like very powerful families. And my understanding is the heir to one of these families, a young woman, was on a private plane, or I should say private plane. She was on a plane flown by like a commercial enterprise, flown by like United or something like that for South Korea. And for whatever reason, I think like she didn't like her meal or something. She went up and was like, "Hey, pilots, turn the plane around," and they did. The pilots were like, "Oh shit," right? And obviously that's mega illegal, right? Like you can imagine the United States, if like the Koch brothers were just like on a United flight and were like, "Hey, turn the plane around," because we say so. That would obviously not be allowed, but they did it, and there was this huge uproar, like she better be held responsible and stuff. It was a huge controversy. I think at the end of the day, like she apologized and got like basically like a fine or something like this, but ultimately did not face significant punishment as a result. So yeah, those chaebols, great example and very influential in South Korean politics to this day. Sort of goes to show you what he was talking about originally, how citizens are these strategies are limited by what citizens will accept, right? In South Korea's instance, let's say, I don't even know if it's actually true that the chaebol were economically effective, but let's say the chaebol are economically effective. The South Korean government has to also balance the fact that their citizens don't like this. They don't like the fact that this giant corporation gets special rights and gets to do things that other corporations don't. So there's a real balancing act there. And we were just talking about TPP. TPP, ultimate example, right? Super beneficial policy, in my opinion, quite objectively so, but goes down the gutter because it wasn't sold correctly, and the will of the people is required in order to get these kind of things to get through.
This is just kind of a tangent, but you got me thinking about, like, should that really be a crime for her to ask the plane to turn around? Like, did she, like, threaten them or something to get them to do it?
Yeah, I think to be fair, the immediate crime would be the pilots who did it, who were like, you are not supposed to do that, Mr. Pilot.
Yeah, I would have thought like, it sounds to me like I would want to blame the pilots more than I want to blame her, but if she's like threatening them somehow, then maybe the situation's different.
Yeah, let me see if I can look up the specifics and get back to you on that.
Said, the geoeconomic strategies of liberal and less liberal economies are distinctly different, and this will be examined in the rest of this video. We can think of geoeconomic strategy as divided into three separate phases. Firstly, the capital phase, where firms receive capital to compete in the global market. Secondly, the directional phase, where firms decide which sectors or markets to aim for. And thirdly, the maintenance phase, where firms attempt to maintain their hard-won position in the market or sector. A liberal geoeconomic strategy is a short-term defensive, long-term offensive strategy. In it, the capital and directional phases are overseen by market forces. Through the profit mechanism, markets will naturally direct capital towards the most capital-rich sectors and markets, and distribute capital according to firm quality, with the most capable getting the most capital. Firms are therefore incentivized to be constantly targeting capital-rich sectors, the capital-rich value chain positions within those sectors, and capital-rich markets. Over the long term, this creates a hyper-competitive economy that will naturally dominate the higher echelons of economic sectors and markets, generating significant geoeconomic and geopolitical benefits for the state. The state's support during these phases should mainly consist of getting out of the way, with intervention limited to smoothing out market failures, providing public goods and infrastructure, and spearheading research in areas where the market has not yet caught up to. Note that the liberal geoeconomic strategy is not the state abdicating all control to the market, and it is in the maintenance phase that the state's role becomes paramount. This is because the liberal strategy is based on free and fair markets. No firm, no matter how hyper-competitive, can compete for long against free or cheating. The state must therefore use the regulatory means at its disposal to set up, enforce, and update a set of rules that would maximize the effect of its liberal strategy. Internally, it should promote things like competitiveness, free movement of capital and labor, and so on, perhaps using standards to encourage innovation and upgrading within the economy. Externally, which is far more important, the state should also insist that the only way others can compete on an equal basis is by conforming to the state's own rules and geopolitical outlook. Ideally, the choice is for rivals to concede geopolitical victory to the state in return for participating in the state's economic.
This seems to be like all strategy from the point of view of a nation that's already extremely economically powerful, where it just they seem to be taking for granted that whoever it is that's implementing this strategy is able to pressure others from the outside, right? But I guess it's they aren't. Well, there's a little bit of time in the video still left, but they haven't yet talked at all about what would be the strategy for for a country with like middling leverage, right? I mean, obviously, a country that's not very powerful at all has very limited strategies that it can do, but something in the middle might have more. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
Economic dynamism, or to refuse and lose in the long run anyway, as the state outcompetes and dominates the rival's economy. As such, the state should neither hesitate in creating a protected market that keeps out unreformed rivals, nor should it shy away from financially supporting a firm that is disadvantaged against an external rival. This blueprint can be seen as a purist and more aggressive version of the proposed Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic Free Trade Partnerships, which sought to create a free trade bloc that forced geopolitical rivals to either adopt Western economic and geopolitical norms or be unable to benefit from the Western market. The liberal strategy is fairly straightforward, but it is not without drawbacks. The key one is that in a liberal strategy, the state has limited control over direction. In practice, states retain many tools to incentivize market forces in the desired geoeconomic direction, but in general, they have little control over where specific capital goes. This, of course, becomes a problem when it comes to capital-poor but strategic sectors and markets, where lack of market interest creates vacuums which a less market-conscious rival can exploit. The geoeconomic successes that Chinese companies have enjoyed in the transport and communications infrastructure sectors, as well as in developing markets from the South Pacific to Africa to Latin America, are a product of Western disinterest as much as Chinese strategy. Related to this is the broader issue that liberal geoeconomics tends to devolve into pure economics, where the state, driven by dogma and entrenched interests, gets out of the market regardless of its impact on geoeconomic goals. A liberal strategy requires constant management to prevent market forces from overpowering geoeconomic logic. Current worries may include excessive financialization, where firms cut production or underinvest for the sake of stock prices, and perhaps Western underinvestment in the public goods, especially education and infrastructure, that are necessary to a competitive and high value chain economy. In short, a liberal strategy is not an excuse for governments to forget about the economy. Free markets are a means, not the end, and they should be curbed whenever they start interfering with geoeconomic or geopolitical goals. The trick is to find that sweet spot where economically dominant firms take the offensive thanks to helpful market forces and are defended from unhelpful ones through government intervention. Contrasted with the liberal strategy is the developmentalist strategy, so called because of its origins in German and East Asian developmental economics. Here, the state directs capital towards favored national champions, directs them towards certain targets, and supports them so that they can maintain their positions in the long run. In short, it is a short-term offensive, long-term defensive strategy. The developmentalist strategy is especially relevant where the free market is unwilling or unable to achieve geoeconomic goals. We have seen how markets can ignore geopolitically significant but capital-poor territory. In poor, underdeveloped countries, markets may not even be able to concentrate enough capital to achieve meaningful economic growth. State intervention is therefore the alternative. Financial means are liberally used to infuse select champions with capital. Externally and internally protected markets allow champions to extract as much capital as possible from the public. Direct state support will be financed by taxation or by a negative real interest rate regime that converts the public's savings into usable capital. In both cases, the state suppresses domestic consumption and transfers the money saved into investment. In return for the support, champions must follow the state's directions and target specific industries. Competent bureaucracies will tailor targets to ensure that the limited capital is focused on capital-rich or geoeconomically significant sectors within the technological capabilities of the champions. And since champions cannot rely on the suppressed domestic market to buy their goods, they have to export overseas for their profits, which in the East Asian case meant exporting to the US. Given the many cost advantages they are working under, champions should easily undercut the firms in their chosen market and quickly become a relevant force in their sector. The profits they earn will either be used to invest in themselves and advance up the value chain, or be repaid to the state, who will use the money to fuel another national champion. With appropriate state financing and direction, most champions can easily dominate the lower segments of a value chain based on cost advantage.
Sorry, just an update on the plane thing. I've got it here. It's called the Nut Rage Incident, also referred to as Nutgate. December 5th, 2014, John F. Kennedy International Airport, New York City, aboard Korean Air Flight 086. Korean Air Vice President Heather Cho, dissatisfied with the way a flight attendant served nuts on the plane, ordered the aircraft to return to the gate before takeoff. Blah, 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 blah. She questioned the cabin crew about the standard procedure of serving the nuts. After a heated confrontation, Cho assaulted him being the cabin crew chief, and ordered him off the plane, requiring a return to the gate and a delay of the flight about 20 minutes. The incident became public. Cho and Korean Air were heavily criticized. In the aftermath, Cho resigned from one of her several executive positions. She was subsequently found guilty in a South Korean court of obstructing aviation safety and given a 12-month prison sentence, of which she served 5 months. The flight attendant and cabin crew chief returned to their positions by April 2016.
It's funny because, like, in a way that does seem like the behavior of a very entitled, but, you know, like, aristocrat. But on the other hand, she did get prosecuted and went to prison for it. So I don't know. Like,
yeah, I think specifically there was like an attempted cover up before there was then an investigation that eventually had her go to jail.
All right. Well, she assaulted somebody, so yeah, I'm going with yes. That should be a crime.
These positions are not capital rich nor powerful, and a champion here will always be vulnerable to political or market developments that can make it obsolete in an instant. To maintain the state's foothold in this sector, therefore, a champion must continue to receive constant support as it attempts to advance up the value chain. Some level of innovation is required for a champion to advance up the value chain. Long term, this requires the state to pour additional capital into building the required knowledge and educational structures. In the meantime, it can have champions compete with each other for subsidies or loans, weeding out the unfit in the process. Alternatively, the state can cheat and support its champions through enforced tech transfers and industrial espionage, allowing them to keep abreast of the latest developments. Repeat this cycle enough times, and eventually the champion will reach a scale and value chain position where it can actually begin making a genuine profit and start contributing to state coffers. Long before that, however, it would have already become a growth pole, stimulating internal development and bringing the economy closer to the level where it can start fueling itself. The meteoric rise of Japan, South Korea, and now China is proof of the power of this blueprint, but there are also glaring drawbacks. Firstly, state intervention on this scale and timeline creates significant market distortions. Cronyism and inefficiencies are to be expected, but to scrounge up the capital to fuel champions, states either take on massive debt or manipulate currencies and capital flows to get the real interest rates they want. And few states have been able to forever defy the laws of economic gravity, from the Japanese asset bubble of the late 80s to the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to China's current debt overhang. The second drawback, which is less of a drawback and more of a tough prerequisite, is that the developmentalist strategy requires international tolerance. A key step in this strategy is to have states gain capital by exporting to overseas markets under pretty unfair conditions, undercutting other firms in the process. There is no reason why the export destination should tolerate this. Indeed, the liberal strategy's emphasis on free and fair markets was to prevent this sort of one-sided deal in the first place. During the Cold War, the US tolerated Japanese and South Korean practices because their increased strength was a geopolitical gain. This is not the case for China, and accordingly, US tolerance is wearing thin. It's not clear whether the developmentalist strategy will be as successful in a less unconditionally open trade environment. In short, the developmentalist strategy has the state put the economy into capital-generating gear. Domestic consumption is suppressed, capital earned from overseas exports is brought in, and the money is invested into select national champions, whose task is to exploit their many advantages to seize the desired geoeconomic territory. Its historical effectiveness is undeniable, but it may be a product of circumstance. Additionally, the state can only defy economic logic for so long before coming back to reality in the form of an economic crisis. Over the course of this video, we have seen how geoeconomics is relevant to modern geopolitics. By dominating key industrial sectors, value chain positions, and markets, geoeconomic powers can suppress hostile activities of dependent countries and thus win geopolitical conflicts by default. Domination requires abundant and strategic use of capital, leading to two general strategic blueprints: a liberal one, where the free market directs capital, and a developmentalist one, where the state provides direction. Most countries recognize the need for both dynamism and direction and will combine elements of both in their strategy. In an age of muted political conflict, geoeconomic competition is becoming more relevant in the quest for global power and influence. It is important to remember, however, that geoeconomics is not a substitute for geopolitics. In the last counting, states still value security and political control over economic comfort, and geoeconomics provides the means, not the end, of achieving that. Thanks for watching the video, and please like and subscribe. If you have any comments or questions, I'll be happy to respond to them in the comments section.
That was pretty interesting. One other thing I wanted to add was that some of the stuff towards the beginning of the video, like where they were talking about like what if Britain invests in cloth and Portugal invests in wine. It seems like strategically relevant information, but on the other hand, it's like when I'm thinking about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, obviously they didn't know how that was going to turn out, right? Because it's almost like framing it as if Portugal made a bad decision by being in the wine industry more than the cloth industry, but of course they didn't know.
Yeah, sort of an interesting parallel to that would be the ways in which other countries industrialized intentionally versus others sort of accidentally. And countries that tend to have industrialized much more intentionally did so much more rapidly, got the benefits quicker, but also a lot of the downsides came a lot faster as well.
Right, and I think that's kind of the stuff that they were talking about toward the end, like with South Korea, Japan, and China, right? It's like these countries are able to industrialize intentionally because they have the example of earlier countries who did it like unintentionally, right? Like when Britain was doing it, they didn't like have a specific plan that they were trying to emulate, obviously, right? They were just trying to let their economy develop as best they could, but then their success now gives a template for other countries to follow. Yeah, I don't know. You got anything else you want to add?
Nope. In fact, I've got to run, but thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for joining me. See you next week, and I'm gonna raid you.
Oh well, I'm about to go offline because the panel I'm on has someone who's banned off Twitch. So.
Oh, okay. well, all right. See ya.
Yep. See ya.